This podcast is sponsored by Preparedwise.com. When you're looking to expand your food storage, check out Preparedwise.com because I think you're going to like the food that they have. One of the new things they have is a line of pet food for dogs and cats. I think they're one of the first food companies to actually have storage food for pets, and it makes it far easier to store some food for your animals when you're looking at food that has a 10-year shelf life. And don't forget, if you call in your order at 888-545-6265 and mention that you heard about them on the Preparedness Podcast, they'll take 5% off your order. That's Preparewise.com. Howdy, folks. Rob Hannes here with the Preparedness Podcast, the podcast that brings you the best in preparedness information. Today, we're going to be talking about 3 things that you should be preparing for now. These are things that should be on your preparedness horizon or your preparedness radar, and you should be looking at getting ready for these things. Just a couple quick announcements. The EMP book is in print. You'll find that on the website. If you haven't had the chance to sign up for the tips or take the listener survey, go to the website, click on the little links, and you can take care of that. Also, the Preparedness Capability Checklist book is nearing completion. I know it's taking longer than I expected. I apologize for how long it's taking. It's kind of surprising how long this project has been, but we are nearing completion. I'm really hoping it's going to be ready for the Preparedness Expo next month, early next month. That's the Prepare to Endure Emergency Preparedness Expo in Bakersfield, California, June 8th and 9th at the Kern County Fairgrounds. You can find out more about the expo, when the times are, and who's going to be speaking there, including myself, at prepare2endure.com, and that's the number 2. So prepare, the number 2, endure.com, and you'll find out all about the great information going on there. To be honest, I don't know about you, but May has been an incredibly busy month for me, and I can't even put my finger on why. Very busy at work. Usually the end of the month, new month turnover is pretty busy, but since May started, I just haven't stopped. It's been like one thing after another, and it just seems that everything has been busy. The book is out, trying to get some more podcasts out, family issues. It's the end of school, just lots of stuff going on, and I wish I could point to my finger and say, okay, I can cut this out and have more time, but I'm sure you experience the same thing, so bear with me if I seem a little rushed right now, because I'm trying to get this out early morning as opposed to later at night when I usually record them. And as you can probably hear in my voice, I also am just getting over a cold. It was another one of these fast-hitting colds. I had one of these a few months ago where it hit me to a point where I actually had to stay in bed at home from work, but the next day I was much, much better. This one wasn't quite as severe, but it did hit me really hard, and then it went away pretty fast. My voice is still kind of affected, still kind of have a little bit of a post-nasal drip going, but it's kind of interesting how I never used to be affected by these types of colds. I don't know if this is a new sort of cold virus or if this is something that's just affecting me as I get older, but I seem to be hit faster and harder, but for a very short period of time. And this is similar to what I want to talk about on one of the 3 things that I think you should be looking at, and that is pandemic flu. Now, I'm not saying this because we have a threat right now that is lurking out there, ready to pounce on us. I don't think it's quite that bad. There's been a couple news stories about 2 viruses lately, the H7N9 bird flu or avian flu that's out there. So far, there's been 141 cases and 35 deaths. That's a 25% mortality rate. I'm not really sure if we should be concerned, though, because the numbers are remaining pretty small, and it's over a protracted period. So it's not like 2 weeks ago nobody was infected, and then now we have 141 cases. That would become kind of alarming. But this has been pretty much for months now. I don't know if it's been all winter, but I think it has. So you don't need to be panicky about it. It's definitely not something you need to run out right now and get all your supplies and panic about it. But it is something to be concerned about because these avian flus are a concern. They are mutating and changing. The last one we had was H7N9, which is still out there. It could still be a threat. Just this morning, I had received an email alert from the RSOE, Emergency and Disaster Information Service. This is that service out of Budapest, Hungary. And they do a pretty good job of monitoring what's going on around the world, not just for natural disasters, but technology disasters and all sorts of hazards that are out there. But there was a new outbreak of H5N1 among the duck population, and they just had to cull 164,000 ducks because of this. Now, this isn't an issue that we need to be concerned about right now, but it is something that we need to watch. And certain news articles have been kind of amping up the panic button a little bit too much in their articles, and I wanted to point out that it's not time to panic. It's almost never time to panic, but this isn't to a level yet that we need to be concerned about. The other one is this new coronavirus. It's a novel coronavirus. Coronaviruses are known to cause respiratory infections like pneumonia, and sometimes they can cause kidney failure. Now, these coronaviruses are in the same family of viruses that cause the common cold and SARS, or the severe acute respiratory syndrome. And there have been several articles about this virus, and there's even been a few that are talking about both the H7N9 and this novel coronavirus in a manner that makes it sound like, oh my gosh, we're right on the brink of another pandemic, and it's not that bad yet. For example, since 2012, there have only been 34 confirmed cases across Europe and the Middle East. So it's not like it's a rampant infection that is affecting everything. Now, if you remember back when SARS was happening years ago, I think it was about 10, 11 years ago, that was something to be concerned about because it spread so fast. Luckily, it had a fairly low mortality rate. When the H5N1 virus hit the stage, it too had a high infection rate, and it had a pretty decent mortality rate, but still not that bad. And it did not turn out to be anything bad, at least not yet. But the thing to keep in mind is that these viruses are continually mutating, and they are looking for better ways to spread themselves. I mean, that's what viruses do. They look at what they're not like live beings that are trying to solve this, but that's what the mutations are in these viruses. They're trying to figure out different combinations of infection, what allows them to spread themselves, because that's what viruses want to do. And the fear is that it's possible at some point these mutations, or the correct mutations, will occur that will allow the virus to become highly contagious, which means that it's easily transmitted from human to human, not animal to human, which a lot of we have right now with the H7N9 and the H5N1. A lot of this is a lot of these infections are due to animal to human, and that's why when you read these reports, you'll see that the concern is they're watching for human to human transmission, and an easy human to human transmission, because that is a problem. Once it can jump from humans quite easily, it's going to spread rapidly across the globe. The other factor is how lethal it is. What is the mortality rate? Now, that's the thing about viruses, is the more lethal they are, like Ebola. Ebola's got an extremely high mortality rate, but when outbreaks occur, they tend to die out because the virus kills the host so fast that it doesn't allow it to spread very fast. It also helps that a lot of these infections are in African communities that are fairly isolated from each other, so there's a limited amount of spreading. But even if Ebola got onto a jet plane and into a major metropolitan area, it burns out fairly fast. If it was to slow down a little bit, if it didn't kill its host as fast as it did, let's say it only had a 50% mortality rate, as opposed to, I think, the 98 or 95% that it has now, it would spread a lot faster, a lot farther, and kill a lot more people because more hosts are surviving, which allows them to spread it to more people. And that's the concern. And both of these viruses, both the coronavirus and these avian flu viruses, and that's the concern that we have with these viruses. And so when you're looking at reports, whether it's an article or a WHO update or whatever, look for those factors. What's the infection rate? What's the mortality rate? How many cases are current? How many cases of infection have ended up in death? And what's the transmission rate? Because that will tell you whether or not it's really a concern right now. For example, this novel coronavirus, there have been 34 confirmed cases. Now, confirmed means that these people have been tested and the virus was confirmed to be this specific virus. There probably has been more infections, but it's hard to say how many because not everybody is tested. But of the 34 that have been confirmed, 18 of these resulted in death. That's a 53% mortality rate. That is something to be concerned about because if this was ever to get widespread, a lot of people would be dying. Now, contrast this with the swine flu pandemic of a few years ago. Yes, it was a real pandemic. Yes, there was a real concern with it. And yes, it did go global and spread, and a lot of people caught it. Luckily for us, though, it had a very low mortality rate, so people recovered. People would get sick, and they would get better. And it was still a pandemic, and it still caused a lot of people in the medical community to kind of hold their breath a little bit because they wasn't sure how bad it was going to be, and it spread very rapidly. I remember getting a news alert, an email about this case in Mexico, or these cases in Mexico, and it just kind of set the red flags and bells off in my head when I read the report, because it was like, this is what we're looking for: high transmission and a significant mortality rate. Now, luckily, the mortality rate was overestimated, or perhaps what happened is initially the flu virus had a high mortality rate or a higher death rate, and as it mutated to become more infectious, the lethality of it was reduced. And that happens. I mean, this is what these mutations do. So we kind of got lucky with this one. And a lot of people point to this, oh, see, they're just claiming the sky is falling and we don't really need to listen because, see, it didn't happen. And I think as a prepper, that's not how you should look at it. We should look at this and say, see, pandemics still do happen. It's not just something that our parents and grandparents told us about. This is still a very real possibility, and we need to be prepared for this. Another thing to keep in mind when you're reading these reports or these news stories about these viruses and stuff, you have to keep in mind where they're occurring. And a lot of times these reports are coming from the World Health Organization or some other global entity or organization, and they're looking at this virus as the virus affects people in general and how it affects those people in the area where the infection is. So there may be an infection in China or North Korea or Europe or the Middle East or something like that. It doesn't mean that the virus is bad enough to affect and go global. So you kind of have to filter what they're talking about. I mean, you know, for example, the WHO, which is the World Health Organization, Assistant Director General, and I know I'm going to probably mispronounce his name, but it's Kiji Fukta, said on Sunday that he's concerned about person-to-person transmission. Of most concern, and this is a quote, of most concern, however, is the fact that the different clusters seen in multiple countries increasingly support the hypothesis that when there is close contact, this novel coronavirus can transmit from person to person, end quote. Now, what they're talking about here are the clusters where these infections have occurred. They're not occurring sporadically. They're occurring in clusters of people who are basically living in a very tight-knit community, or either a family or a very close community. And so they're looking at that sort of transmission. Now, somebody who doesn't understand that and writes an article about, oh my gosh, look, we need to be concerned. This is the next plague to kill us all. You really need to take that with a grain of salt, and you need to do your own research and look at the facts that are happening with these viruses and make your own decision about whether or not there is a concern. However, that being said, there is a concern for pandemic flu or a pandemic virus to spread across the globe and affect us. It is possible. It's happened in the past. It happened recently, although it was a very low mortality rate, so it wasn't much of a concern. But just because they don't pose a threat today, it doesn't mean that they can't pose a threat tomorrow. And so this is one of the things that you should be preparing for, because as a prepper, you should be looking at things that are on the horizon. And you should be looking at whatever possible events are out there, playing those what-if scenarios in your head, and prepare for these events now. And that's why we're preppers. We're not panickers. We're not, or we shouldn't be. We shouldn't be people who only respond to the current disaster of the day as it's unfolding. That's not what preparedness is being about. You're not prepared if you're trying to run around and grab supplies in the midst of a disaster. You need to prepare for it. So this is one of the things you need to do. And to me, it's important to do it now because nobody else is panicking about it. It's not in the mainstream news. Nobody's is concerned or panicked about it. When we had that scare of about H7N9 years ago, and then much more recently, we actually had the swine flu pandemic. You could not find supplies, N100 masks, N95 masks, any sort of decon and medication and stuff like that, Tamiflu. It was flying off the shelf because it was being bought up by people who were panicking because they didn't have supplies. We've seen this before in the past, which is why we need to be prepared. How do you prepare for this? Well, you need to be prepared to isolate yourself in your house. You should have some N100 masks. You should probably have some gowns and gloves and goggles to protect yourself from infection. I say N100 because they are far superior than N95. Your mask should have an outflow valve. What that does is prevent the buildup of moisture on the inside of your mask. This allows you to wear it longer without the filter element breaking down, because if that filter element gets wet, it doesn't filter like it should. You should look into having some decontamination supplies. You should look at how you can isolate and build a safe room that has a filtered forced air, so you're providing positive ventilation in an area in your house so that the viruses can't leak in through the walls and the outlets and cracks and vents and stuff, and you're providing filtered air into this safe area. We're going to be getting into more of this in the coming months, because this is like the next area that I think I want to start focusing on in the podcast. It's far too much information to gloss over now, but these are some of the things that you should start looking at. The second thing that you should be preparing for is hurricane season. Now, if you're in Wisconsin, you probably don't need to worry about this, but those of us that live on the coast, you should be looking at preparing for hurricane season. Hurricanes are, I don't want to say they're fickle, but you never know what is going to happen. We'll have a forecast of, it's going to be a heavy hurricane season with a lot of severe hurricanes, and it never materializes. And then we'll have seasons that are average or below average, and it'll produce a killer storm, meaning one that hits land and destroys a lot and kills some people. So again, don't be the guy who is waiting in line at Home Depot and hoping that they have sheets of plywood available. You should be preparing now. Hurricane season is generally June 1st to November 30th. It's right around the corner. You should start looking. If you just moved, you should start looking at this now and looking at the history of your area. If you've lived in hurricane country for a while and you're a prepper, hopefully you're talking back to me right now saying, Rob, got it all handled. totally prepared for a hurricane. And that's what you should do. You should look at any event that happens and go, I'm ready for that. If you're struggling and scrambling for ammunition now, not because you want to go shooting for the weekend and have some fun, but because you feel that you don't have enough ammunition on hand if we had a grid down or some sort of situation where there was a lot of looting and crime and stuff. If you don't have enough ammunition, then you fail to prepare to purchase enough ammunition when it was available. Now it's really difficult to get. And this is what we do. We're preppers. We're supposed to be preparing for events that might happen so that when they do happen, we can survive and take care of our families as good as possible. So if you're in hurricane country, you should be preparing now. Now, I said there were 3 things that I wanted to talk about today that you should be preparing for. Quite honestly, if you're a new prepper, there's a lot of things you should be preparing for. If you're a hobby prepper who have been doing this for a while but haven't really been that serious about it, there's probably a lot of things that you should be preparing for as well. Most preppers I know are not fully prepared. They're not 100% prepared for every contingency. There's always something else that can be done. I'm in the same boat as everybody else. Even though I've been prepping for over 25 years, conditions change. The food I stored way back then, it's nowhere near good anymore. It's either been consumed or thrown out or given away. The equipment that I had way back then, most of it is either deteriorated or broken, or I've replaced it with new stuff, or it should be replaced with new stuff. So there's always a constant evolution of preparedness. I mean, think about when you were a kid, you don't think about the same things that you do now. You evolve, you change, you get married, you have a family, now you have a dog or you have a cat and you got to take care of that. All these things are constantly changing. So everybody is in a constant state of preparedness flux. And that's what the podcast is about. It's about helping you focus on a few things instead of getting overwhelmed with all these things that you should be doing. Or you make your list, you're like, oh my gosh, I got to be prepared for all this. Well, that's what I'm trying to help you do is get focused on a few things at a time. Use the commonality of these disasters or these threats and make the appropriate preparation so that you're as prepared as possible should some of this stuff happen. The third thing I wanted to talk about is a pending food crisis. Now, I know we've heard this for years now, but it's not something that's a what if. There is food crisis in certain parts of the world. We don't have so much of a food crisis here in the United States for a variety of reasons, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. And we can see the effects of a food crisis, and we have here in this country before. Lack of certain foods. We had a rice shortage a couple years ago. We've seen food prices spike for a variety of reasons. And so this is one of the things you should be continually working on is increasing your food storage. Now, we did have some rain recently in these areas that were affected by the drought, but because the drought was so severe, what happened is that the rains caused flooding. And because right now we're in a climate cycle that is based on extremes. In fact, this is more normal than what we're used to over the past 70, 80 years. And that is extremes. Drier dries, wetter wets. And this sort of extremism in the weather can cause big problems with food production. And so even without the food crisis potential here, you should probably be increasing your food stocks on a regular basis and continually anyways. Now, whether that means you're increasing your pantry food, increasing your long-term storage food, whether it's ready-to-eat meals, whether it is bulk foods, you should be increasing it. Even if like one of my advertisers, Legacy Foods, if you go to PrepareWise and buy, just a small amount every month and slowly increase that, because that storage food is 25 years, you're not going to have to worry about rotating as often. That's one of the reasons I like this food. Your pantry food, on the other hand, you're going to have to be constantly rotating that out. So make sure you store what you eat and you eat what you store so that you're not buying, cans of gelatinized whole chicken or chili that you don't really eat, but it was cheap enough and you say to yourself, well, if I was really hungry, I'd eat it. That stuff tends to sit on your shelf a long time. It takes up space, and yes, it is food, but a lot of times, and I've talked to a lot of preppers who do this, and I've done this myself. My wife and I did this for Y2K. We wanted to make sure we had food, and so we bought cheaper food so that we could have more of it, and we ended up throwing a lot of it out, and that which hadn't expired we had given away because we didn't eat that type of food. And it turned out it was a really big lesson for us, and it was glad that we had the food, but I would have rather have had the food that we could have eaten so that we didn't waste the money that we did. So this is one of those things that we are continually seeing in the news of a crisis or a pending crisis or a potential problem with the food or the food crops or droughts or floods or whatever. So don't be caught in a food crisis without any food, because take the time, make a plan, and slowly build up your pantry food, and then slowly build up some bulk food, and slowly build up your long-term ready-to-eat meals and stuff. Because you never know what's going to affect the food supply. We've got this wheat rust that we talked about several years ago, and I think in Iraq and Iran or in the Middle East. That's supposed to be hitting us here in the States, I think, soon. I don't think they've have a solution for that yet. There are droughts and floods all across the world that affects. Remember, the food supply is a global food supply. Everybody imports and exports. When Russia decides it doesn't want to export wheat because they had a bad season, they want to keep it for their citizens, we experience a price increase and sometimes shortages. When Asian countries have food problems, floods, droughts, fires, and they don't have enough rice to export or whatever other foodstuffs they have, it causes shortages in the rest of the world. And there are countries right now that are in chronic food shortages because there just isn't enough food in the country. And this causes food stress for the rest of the world. So it is something, it's a chronic issue that we have to live with today. And I think it's something that is prudent enough that we should be preparing for on a regular basis. So that's pretty much it for this podcast. I'm going to go ahead and close it out here. But before I do, I wanted to point out that if you haven't noticed, in the past 24 hours, the sun has unleashed 3 X-class flares, which suggests that the sun is becoming very active, and one of these sunspots that is creating all these flares is turning towards the Earth. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to get hit. That doesn't mean anything other than the sun is more active, and this is something, again, that you should be paying attention to. We've covered this, what CMEs can do. There is a difference between flares and CMEs, but you have to keep in mind that the media doesn't understand the difference and often says flare when they mean CME. So you need to pay attention to what's going on. The sun is supposed to be in a highly active period this year and next. Scientists are concerned about a CME, a large CME hitting the Earth, which can take down the power grid and stuff. And so it's just another one of those things that we need to keep our eye on. So until next time, folks, enjoy life and stay safe.